All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, The French-Speaking Cajuns of World War II, Forging an Identity. My name is Amanda McFillin. I'm the programming manager here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And I just say a few words tonight before we introduce our speakers for the evening. We are delighted to be co-presenting this event with our colleagues at the National World War II Museum. Many of you may have heard about this program through their outreach, and we're delighted that you've joined us here this evening. I've just been watching the chat now as everybody's coming in here, and we've got a lot of Louisianians, but a lot of people from around the country too. We're so excited to see everyone here. And to those of you who know us from the Historic New Orleans Collection, welcome back. We're glad to see you as well. Tonight's program is part of a larger slate of programs that we have been running here at the collection to celebrate our current exhibition, Cajun Documents, Acadiana, 1973 to 74. This exhibition presents a series of photographs taken between 1973 and 74 by photographers Charles Traub and Douglas Boz. As young grad students, they traveled down to South Louisiana and photographed the people, places, and cultural traditions that they encountered along the way. Over the past 6 months, we've explored Cajun identity, Cajun cooking, Cajun music, and more. And you can find a link to the virtual exhibition Cajun document here in the chat. I'm going to be posting in just a second, and we hope you'll check it out sometime this evening. Just to let you know, we're also going to be chatting with our curator of this exhibition, John Lawrence, and photographers Charles Traub and Douglas Boz this Friday at noon. The link to register for that event will be posted in the chat as well. So we hope you can join us then. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers for the evening, but just a quick note about how the program's going to run in the Q&A. Dr. Jason Theriot and Dr. Dawsey are going to be with us tonight talking about the French-speaking Cajuns serving in World War II. After they are done presenting, I'm going to pop back on to moderate the Q&A. And so just if you want to participate in the Q&A, this is how it works. If you're here with us in Zoom, you'll see a toolbar at the bottom of your screen. There's the chat button, which a lot of you are using. That's where you pop in to say, hey, tell us your name, tell us where you're from, tell us what you're thinking about tonight's program, share your memories, do that in the chat feature. If you have a question for Dr. Theriot or Dr. Dawsey, post it in the button that says Q&A. When I come back on at the end of the program, I'm going to look at the Q&A section to find the questions for our speakers. We may not be able to answer everyone's question because there's a lot of people here tonight, but we're going to do our best. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, post your questions there in the comments, and they're going to do their best. Our friends that are on Facebook Live helping us tonight, they're going to do our best to send us those questions here so we can hopefully get to them. All right. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Jason Theriot is an author, historian, and consultant. He earned a doctorate in history from the University of Houston and a degree in journalism from Louisiana State University. Additionally, he is a former energy policy fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He is the author of numerous publications and media projects, including an upcoming book and a related podcast available to stream now at jasontheriot.com. Dr. Dawsey is a research historian at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, where he researches the service records of World War II veterans and writes their biographies for their family members. So Dr. Theriot and Dr. Dawsey, I'm calling them both that because their first names are both Jason, so that's how I'm going to be able to speak to them both tonight. The floor is y'all's. Take it away.
Amanda, thanks very much. I want to just also extend my welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to have you here with us tonight. Before beginning my conversation with Dr. Theriot, I want to thank Amanda McFillin, Amy Williams, Dave Walker, and our friends at the Historic New Orleans Collection for making this event possible. So excited to see this come together and delighted to have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Jason Theriot tonight. So Jason's great to see you.
Great. Jason and everyone at the Historic New Orleans Collection and the National World War II Museum, thank you guys for bringing this together. It's going to be a great night, and thanks to all the viewers out there, wherever you are. We know there's quite a few of y'all, so hope you enjoy the presentation, and we certainly look forward to the question and answer session towards the end. So thanks to everyone involved. A lot of work.
Yeah, well, it has been a lot of work, and we've all been looking forward to this for some time. So, Jason, obviously, there's so much to talk about here. This is a project that you've been working on for for quite a while a long and direct connection to the subject matter about Acadiana, about Cajuns in World War II, about the legacy of their involvement in that conflict. And so we want to get into that with you with several questions. And I think it's always interesting for an audience to learn about how a scholar became interested in a subject, how they came to a topic. And yours is such an interesting direct link, Jason, to this subject matter. Could you tell us about how you got involved in researching this topic?
Sure. Well, it probably began about 20 years ago or so. I had an idea that I wanted to interview my grandfathers about their experience in World War II and maybe some of their friends. And I was living in Houston at the time, and I still am. I had just moved to Houston from South Louisiana, where I was born and raised in Cajun country, and went to speak to one of my grandfathers, Jason Theriot, who was born and raised in Lower Terrebonne Parish in a little community called Boudreaux Canal. Spoke French growing up, as did all of his parents and grandparents. And he served in the Pacific, as did my other grandfather, Harry Jackson. And I asked him, I said, well, I'd really be interested in interviewing you and your friends. Do you guys talk about this? He was a very outgoing person. He was probably involved in no less than a dozen or so retiree clubs, and he went to the swimming pool all the time, and he went to church 8 days a week. And everybody knew this fella. And he says, well, I don't know, that's not something that we talk about, Jason. Okay, that's 20 years ago. The World War II D-Day Museum had just opened up, right? So only at that time were these World War II veterans finally starting to come out and really begin to seek storytellers and to talk to their family and talk to their grandchildren, and to be honored for that, right? And he said, oh no, that's not something that we talk about. I said, well, I found a book. It's called The Honor Roll of Iberia Parish World War II Veterans. Okay, and it was put out right after the war. And it's got about 1,500 names and little captions, and it's alphabetized. Okay, so that's important to remember. Of all the people, or some of the people who served from Iberia Parish, which is my home parish. I'm from New Iberia, born and raised. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you take this book, Honor Roll of Iberia Parish, and you look through there to see if any of your buddies are in there, and then we'll come up with a plan. So the following week, I drive back from Houston to New Iberia, and I go to meet him, and he's ecstatic. He's so excited. And he says, Jason, you won't believe I've got the best news. He says, well, I've got good news and I've got bad news. And I said, well, okay. He says, the good news is I'm all in. And he said, I took a look at your book. And he said, I found 50 of my friends who I talk to every week. And in fact, I've already talked to them. And I've written down their names and their addresses and where they served. And they want you to come interview them. And I said, 50? Oh my gosh, that's way more than the half a dozen or so that I had kind of anticipated. Wow, 50 is a lot. I said, but wait a minute, you mentioned something about the bad news. I said, what's the bad news? He says, well, Jason, I only got to the B's. There's a lot of Boudreaux and Broussards, and that's as far as he got. So that's how it started. And we started.
That's when you realize, right, like how big a subject this was and how much there was to really do with that. No, that's a fantastic story, Jason. And obviously we'll be able to get into the stories of some of these individuals that you've been researching for some time now. I think for our audience though, Jason, we have people obviously who are from South or Southeast Louisiana, a lot of them joining us from East Texas. And so when you say Acadiana or you say Cajun country, they obviously know what you're talking about. We have a lot of people joining us from outside the region. So could you tell us something about when that term is used, what does it really refer to? And what would you want them to know about the history of that region?
Right. So Acadiana technically is considered a 22 parish region of South Louisiana that essentially follows Interstate 10, and then it goes up in what they call the Cajun Prairie. So everything from Lake Charles, Louisiana to near the Mississippi River, near Baton Rouge, doesn't quite cross Baton Rouge, and then up to the prairie country of places like Opelousas and Eunice and Marksville, and all the way down south into the coast, including all of the 9 or so parishes that that align the coast there. And this was a designation that came out in the 1960s, kind of during the rumblings of what we consider the Cajun revival or the Cajun cultural revival movement. Really for the first time that the community in South Louisiana began to embrace this unique Cajun heritage. And so that region became designated as Acadiana to represent the primary group of people before my time, mostly French-speaking people, who for the most part were descendants of the Acadians from the Canadian provinces that fled were expelled from their homelands in the 1750s and 60s and came to Louisiana to become the Cajuns. So that's Cajun country, is the Acadiana region.
You know, that's a nice, very kind of condensed sense about where we're talking about. And obviously in our Q&A, we may have people who want to know a bit more about that earlier history. In the case of the subject that we're dealing with tonight, Jason, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the importance of the French language for Acadiana, obviously, saying the most obvious thing about the importance of this being a French-speaking area. And yet, one of the things your research really points to, is a reminder of, is that the French language was under attack in the state in southern Louisiana prior to World War II. And that is often forgotten. Could you describe what actually had been happening with the French language, the speaking and the teaching of it in that area before 1941?
Right. So in the time period before the World War II Cajuns were born, so let's say, for example, most of the men and women who served in World War II were born prior to 1920. So let's say their parents and their grandparents, they were often ridiculed for speaking French. There was sort of this stigma of the French-speaking people in South Louisiana that they were second-class citizens. They were considered kind of the country bumpkins, right? The peasants. So if you spoke French, you were considered a Cajun or Cajun, as the Anglo derivative of the word Cajun or Cajun came to be, Cajun. So anyone who kind of spoke French was sort of looked down upon in that late 19th century, early 20th century. And then in 1916, there was a called the Louisiana Education Expulsion Act that was passed. And then some years later, again, the Louisiana State Constitution in 1921 sort of confirmed at the time for officially recognizing English as the language of the public school system in Louisiana. And so you can imagine what that did to all the schools in these Acadiana parishes, in the French-speaking parishes in South Louisiana, where most of the kids who became the World War II veterans grew up as French as their first language. Their mom and dad spoke French, very little English. Certainly the grandparents spoke no English. And yet here they are in first and second grade, and they're being forced to not only speak English, but more importantly, Jason, punished if they spoke French. Now, it wasn't widespread, but it did occur in many places. My grandfather, for example, had scars on his knees because he was forced to kneel on crushed pecan shells because he was caught speaking French, or he was not able to ask, could he go to the bathroom in English? And so many of these students were punished, right? Lee Bernard, who's still alive and well, 98 years old, living in Erath, Louisiana. He said he was caught speaking French on the school ground and was forced to write on the chalkboard 500 times, "I will not speak French on the playground." So imagine what that does to a young person's psyche, a young person's confusing world of what's taking place at home, and yet at school it's different. So you can understand, I think most people would probably come to understand that there was this sense of shame, right, of not only your language, but perhaps even some of your culture. And so keep that in mind as we go through the remaining of the show here, because that's very critical, because attitudes change very quickly after World War II began.
Yes, obviously we'll be able to talk a great deal about the importance of knowing French, that, and how indispensable that became with certain tasks, with certain missions that many of these veterans were involved in during the war. We'll definitely get to that. So speaking of the war, Jason, why don't we get into actual, Cajun country, Acadiana in World War II. And I think it's important also for our audience to know that there were many people, many young men from South Louisiana already in the Louisiana National Guard and would be ready really when wartime came. And you have definitely kind of traced out many of these men, their units. One in particular, the Dixie Division you've talked about, but could you describe these men, about their kind of path into World War II and the role they play early in this conflict for the U.S. military?
So let's say you give me back up a little bit further to the Great Depression and the development of the CCC camps. A lot of young men joined these sort of military groups and even joined the National Guard in the late 1930s. It was a way to make a buck, and it was a way to participate in kind of community activities. And by 1940, in November of 1940, in fact, President Roosevelt officially indoctrinated the Louisiana National Guard into the federal armed forces. And so you had what was at the time the 156th Infantry Regiment, which was the Louisiana National Guard. They became nationalized. They were part of the Dixie Division, the 31st Dixie Division, which included National Guard from Oklahoma, Texas. I can't remember where the fourth one was. Nonetheless, many of these young men, 17, 18 years old in 1940, packed up their stuff, left home, and many of them did not return for 4 or 5 years. But they went through some pretty extensive training. They were involved in all of the Louisiana maneuvers. And in fact, I have a little image here. In fact, the image that you guys have been showing is an image of some of these young Cajuns. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. And I hope this works. Bear with me. And yeah, here's an image here. Can you folks see this? Is it up there, Jason?
It looks like it's trying to pull up, but it's.
Well, so what I'm showing an image, which is the image that's been used to kind of promote this event, is about 7 or 8 young men from New Iberia, all Acadian surnames, and they were all very excited to go to basic training and to become part of the American Army, and they went to primarily they went to basic training in Camp Blanding. And it's very interesting that they ran into some of the same kind of criticism for speaking French, because some of these units, they only spoke French. In fact, the Brobridge unit, which was known as Company F of the 2nd Battalion, about 95% of them spoke French and very little English. And the sergeants actually gave drill in French, believe it or not. So could you imagine if you show up at a basic training camp in Camp Blanding, Florida, with a bunch of other National Guard men, and there's several hundred men speaking a foreign language, speaking a different language. I mean, you can imagine what kind of issues that might have caused. So there were even times there's been some testimony there about some of the officers who specifically required English only. And in fact, if you got caught speaking French, you were busted. You had to go run laps. There's even a guy, Leonard Martin from Orneville, who told me he was busted down to a basic private because he kept speaking French. So again, here we are, as these guys are now 18, 19 years old, and there's still sort of this stigma, this attitude of looking down upon the French language. But it didn't take long for the military to realize the value. And as America entered the war, and as we looked into some of the first major campaigns, which would obviously been in North Africa in 1942 and 43, it was really important for the language barrier to be bridged And this Cajun unit, mostly French-speaking Cajuns of the Louisiana National Guard, were sent there to North Africa during the North African campaign. And this is a direct quote from the orders that came down from headquarters. It said, you know, we are separating the 2nd Battalion of the 156th Infantry Regiment and making them as combat military police, quote unquote, due to their French linguistic abilities. And they put them right there in Oran and Casablanca and Tunisia, where many of these guys told wonderful stories and began sending letters home saying, Mom and Dad, you won't believe this, but I've been hired as a French interpreter for a colonel, and I'm driving around in a Jeep with him, or I'm working as an air traffic controller, or I'm working in intelligence. And so it's, you know, it's all of a sudden the military began to recognize, wow, these Cajun Frenchies are pretty valuable.
Jason, was there anything else you wanted people to know about the Dixie Division or this presence in North Africa before we? It's such an interesting topic about how these men, they're very early on in the European theater. Is there anything you wanted to add to that before we?
What's interesting, one of the pieces of primary source material that I came across some years ago was a collection of letters from a Brobridge newspaper newsletter called Yeko Ditesh. And an amateur historian found them, and basically what this set of letters were, they were newsletters to a church, to the Brobridge church there, where these Cajuns from North Africa were writing letters back home. And I'll just read to you a couple of these little excerpts. This is from Andrew Angel from Brobridge. He was part of the 2nd Battalion of the Louisiana National Guard. He says, let me tell you that I'm prouder of my French now than I've ever been, and I use it, he says. Here's another guy, Minton Schwess from Golden Meadow. He says, Louisiana Bayou French goes over very well with the natives of North Africa. There was a guy named Whitney LeBlanc. He actually wrote a letter in French home to his parents. And he says, and this is my best translation, he says, but personally, I have many occasions to put my French to use here in North Africa. And finally, this W.D. Dupree from Lafayette says, for a time, North Africa seemed just like Lafayette. So gradually, they began to realize that, wow, you know, this is something kind of special, that we're being asked to not only use our language, but there's many of us here. And clearly there was a value added there to the military to have these bilingual Cajuns in the military service.
No, it's so interesting. And obviously in your work, you kind of, you know, you take us right through, you know, through the war. And in fact, following that chronology, then in your master's work, and I think in your forthcoming book, you get into is in 1943 that, you know, you just talking here about the National Guard being, these units being nationalized, becoming regular Army, but the role the OSS plays in recruiting young men from Acadiana starting in 1943 is a fascinating part of this history you chronicle. Jason, could you go into that in some detail?
Yeah, if you think about, let's back it up just a little bit to, let's say 1941 or 42. I'll give you one example. So there was a guy named Bernice Lejeune from Church Point, Louisiana, who, when I interviewed him some years ago, he told me when he was being recruited, and at the interview with an Army recruiter, the Army recruiter asked him, so do you speak any foreign languages? And he says, may we? Speak Cajun French. And the recruiter said, I'm sorry, young man, but the Army does not consider that a foreign language. Sure enough, give him a year and a half, he receives orders to be removed from his anti-aircraft unit and sent to North Africa to drive around in a Jeep with a colonel to act as his translator for 2 years. So clearly by this time, the military is becoming aware that there is a pool of bilingual French-speaking people, young men in South Louisiana. And when Wild Bill Donovan creates his organization called the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, America's kind of first clandestine agency, right? he is actively out looking to recruit bilingual people, bilingual soldiers, in this case, French-speaking soldiers, because of the need for them in the coming invasion of Normandy and the retaking of the continent of Europe. So OSS, they had the data, they had a database on these young men, a rudimentary one as it was, but nonetheless, they knew where these guys were, and they went actively recruited them. And one number is that perhaps as many as 50 Cajuns from South Louisiana served in some capacity in the OSS. And I had the honor and the privilege of interviewing about 4 or 5 of them. And then hearing some stories from a handful of others who had passed away long before I got this project started. But anyway, that was an interesting set of circumstances whereby here are a number of French-speaking Cajuns. They're actively being recruited for a very special mission and a new special agency. So these guys go up to Camp David in Washington, D.C., and began to go through some pretty intensive training. And they were being trained by some of the best commandos. They learned all kinds of martial arts tactics, weapons, every kind of weapon that you might find on the battlefield, Morse code, espionage tactics, breaking and entering, demolition, the whole gambit. And they were also taught about the French mores, because if you ended up parachuting, oh, by the way, that was one of the main requirements, is you had to agree to parachute behind enemy lines. And you were acting as if you were a French peasant, because you could speak the patois, you could speak the language, then you better certainly act as the French do. And so these young men were trained in that, and many of them participated in the invasion of Normandy, including Sam Broussard, who was part of, he was an intelligence officer for the 1st Division, who went in on D-Day, D-Day +1, and was very much involved in recruiting French resistance officers in the Brittany area, and was partly responsible for the quick capture of that peninsula and then eventual opening up of the port of Cherbourg. And then Bob LeBlanc, who's still alive and well, 99 years old, living in Abbeville, Louisiana. He was also part of that group, and he went in with Patton's army some days after D-Day. And his job was to drive around in a Jeep with a British radio operator and another Frenchman and ride up to the front and even beyond the lines to, again, communicate to the French resistance, find out who was in charge, discuss what they need, if they need airdrops, and then radio all this information back to headquarters to be able to pinpoint exactly where the German positions were. So these guys were real critical, and they rode ahead of the pack all the way through to the Battle of France and into Belgium. So a really unique opportunity for these French-speaking Cajuns to really showcase their talents on a big stage.
No, it's really extraordinary, and so so much of that I think is just unfamiliar to us, Jason. So the connections between these men and people in the French Resistance. I'm sure the stories that you've helped uncover or in the process of being uncovered on that are really amazing. You've already touched on D-Day, on Normandy. I know this is something you feel strongly about, is that the role Cajuns played in the invasion of Normandy and beyond, including pushing into Belgium later in the conflict, that these French-speaking young men, that their role in that has not really gotten the attention it deserves. What would you want us to know about their activities beyond actually landing on D-Day and like what all sorts of things did they do?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a difficult thing to research, Jason. If you think about the tens of thousands of men, young men who began landing in Normandy and southern France, all in June, July, and August, there were only a small percentage of those who actually spoke French. Many of them were Cajuns from South Louisiana. We don't have numbers. We do have some oral histories. We do have some letters. We do have some testimony, some firsthand accounts of what they did. And for the most part, these guys were unofficial translators for their own particular unit. So they had kind of gone through the whole basic training process with this unit, and the guys from New York or New Jersey or Idaho knew that there was this, this fun-loving Cajun guy who spoke French and sometimes even wrote letters in French, like Sam Broussard did. I got a copy of an original letter right here that he's writing to his parents in French. Okay, so these guys, they weren't the dumb hindquarter boys from the back country as they had been led to believe for all these years. Many of them could read, write, and speak French. So imagine what that does to an army of occupation or an invasion force, a huge military operation that lands in France. You've got to have French-speaking people. You've got to have Frenchie. And that's when the nickname Frenchie became pretty much pronounced. Anybody who was a Cajun from South Louisiana or who could speak the language was called Frenchie. And many of these guys were summoned up, right on the beach. I've got stories of them pulling right up to the beach and, hey, Frenchie, come up here to the front line. We need you to come interpret with this French farmer. He knows where there's a hidden German pillbox that's pouring 88 shells onto the beach. Can you go talk to him and find out the details? And so this was the role that they played early on, and many of them received awards. I've got just a couple of them to mention right here. There was an Alfred Benoit from Carencro, Louisiana, and this was the headline in the Lafayette newspaper. Lafayette man saves the day by talking French, and he was in a glider unit in the 82nd Airborne. And basically, he communicated and provided liaisons with the mayor of Cherbourg in order to go and find where the German positions were, so that they can take them out. And so there was, there's so many different examples of them, but so many more that we'll probably never know about. And so that was a big role that they played all the way through France and even into Belgium. The languages are so similar in that part of the region. So whether it was providing traffic, to be able to read the street signs, to be able to read a map, or to get things like eggs, milk, wine, if you could find it. But so many stories about these Frenchies being invited to the homes of these French people to have dinner, to have conversation, to talk about where they were from and talk about where they've been and to talk about their lives. There's many stories like that I look forward to sharing in the Frenchie book that'll be forthcoming.
It certainly must have been a life-changing experience for these young men. We shouldn't lead our audience on, though, Jason, to think that Cajuns only served in the European theater, which we've been talking about, from North Africa to France and Belgium. They also served in the Pacific. Could you tell us something about those who served in the Pacific theater?
Yeah. Well, part of the research that I've done over the last probably 15 years has been to track down primary source letters. So there's a couple of big collections. I mentioned one already, the Brobridge Church newsletters, where there's hundreds of letters describing places where these Cajuns went and what they saw and what they observed and how they ran into each other and would often speak French. And so there was many occasions in the Pacific where these Cajuns would run into each other, whether it was on a Navy ship or at a port of embarkation or somewhere in Hawaii or one of these little small islands. And they would write a letter home and they'd say, oh, you never guess who I ran into. I ran into, Joe Boudreaux. And boy, did we go to town with our Cajun lingo. So it was almost like it was a sigh of relief for them to have either been on a ship or on these islands for a year or so and be able to see someone that they knew, or more than often they could hear that patois. They could hear a person's accent and saying, hey, where are you from? I'm from South Louisiana. I'm from Savannah. Another big set of letters that I found some years ago and have recently gone back into them, just an amazing gold mine of primary sources, is a set of letters at UL from the president of UL, which was called Southwestern Louisiana Institute at the time, SLI. The President Fletcher there was actively sending out newsletters, and these Cajuns were writing letters back to him. Now, these would have been alumni, or these would have been, you know, students who had done a year or maybe a semester. In some cases, they just accidentally might have received these newsletters. But anyway, there was hundreds of letters going back. And so I've been reading through them, and I'll tell you what is fascinating. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Here's one from a guy named Jim Brignac, who was a Marine in the Pacific. And he says he's writing a letter, and he's saying, you know, incidentally, I'm another Cajun, as you can tell by my name, and proud of it too, although I haven't run across any Cajun Marines yet. These stories like this. There was a guy by the name of John Baque, who was from Crowley, who was an older guy, and he was a farmer, and he was sent by the U.S. military to New Caledonia to begin running a food distribution plantation where he was growing food, because New Caledonia was a French colony, as was New Guinea and a few other places. So there's lots of stories, lots of letters of these Cajuns writing back, not just men, but also women, nurses writing back, and talking about how their French language is just a nice little benefit to their uncomfortable stay in the jungles of the Pacific, and how they were able to, you know, get just a bit of an advantage over it, to be able to communicate to the natives and so forth. So yeah, certainly in the Pacific, where their language may not have been used to a great deal for military operations, but certainly conversing with the natives and with the local populations was really interesting to read, for sure.
Yeah, that they were in these places where they could utilize their French language skills. For our audience, Jason, I just want to make sure that that people weren't uncertain about terminology when you're referring to UL. You're obviously referring to University of Louisiana at Lafayette, right? Just for people to make sure, and that's obviously been a major part of your research, is dealt with source materials. They're a place that's it's a wonderful place and a wonderful city in Cajun country. That leads, though, getting here to my part of this conversation, Jason. I want to close my section of this before we bring Amanda back in by asking about a really moving story about one of these World War II veterans, Houston Duhan, that you describe. It's a really remarkable story.
Yeah, one of the first groups of veterans who I went to interview shortly after my grandfather told me that, hey, we got 50, let's get rolling. That 50 turned into 150 after 5 years, believe it or not. But one of the first groups that we went to interview was a group of veterans from Loreville, Louisiana, and one of them was Carol Metier. And Carol was a D-Day veteran. He went in with the 197th AAA anti-aircraft artillery battalion, and they had 50 caliber machine guns. And so he and his best friend, named Houston Duhan. Houston Duhan was from the little town of New Iberia, and Carol was from the little town of Loreville. They were buddies, and they went through all sorts of training together. And they were on a 50 caliber machine gun, and they landed at Omaha Beach on the morning of D-Day on the first wave on the Easy Red sector, exit 1. And as soon as they got off of the Higgins boats, they were the last two to come off. Houston Duhan took a bullet in somewhere in the upper torso and probably, died instantly. And so Carol Metier is telling me the story. He carries the body over to the beach and he leaves him there, and it's the last time he sees him, and he's off to fend for himself, right? And so I interview, Mr. Carroll some 60 plus years later about this experience, and hearing the details and the emotion and the horrific scene that that he had been gone through and experienced, but never knowing or having any closure on what happened to his friend, Houston Duhan. So some years after that, nearing the 60th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, so this would have been 2004, or maybe a year before that, a friend of mine named Shane Bernard came up with an idea because he had found a gravestone of Houston Duhan at the Omaha Beach Cemetery in St. Laurent. And he said, Jason, do you know anything about this? I said, well, yeah, this was a story told to me by the guy who was right there next to him. So Shane and I came up with an idea that maybe we should do something special to honor this fallen Cajun GI named Houston Duhan. We did some research, and he's probably one of the only ones who's actually killed on the beach that day, a native-born Cajun. So we set out to see what we can do. See could we donate a wreath at his graveside on the 60th anniversary. So fast forwarding, we actually had a plaque made that was given to his Houston surviving sibling in the town square on the 60th anniversary, while I was halfway around the world dropping off a wreath at Houston Duhan's gravesite. And alongside me was a fellow by the name of Al Spoonheimer, who was a medic in the 397 anti-aircraft, his unit came alongside of the 197. They were in half tracks. They didn't suffer any casualties. But most of the men that he treated, this was the Al Spoonheimer, on the beach that day were from the 197. And he was awarded a Silver Star, never fired a shot for treating all of those wounded and then ultimately becoming somewhat responsible for the burial of the dead. So it's possible that he may have, seen Houston Duhan, and by luck of the draw, ended up on a tour bus for the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours with that group, with Al Spoonheimer, and got to go and visit the grave. So he and I became friends, and it was quite a life-changing event for me, to say the least. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to go and visit a really remarkable place in the world, which is Normandy Beaches, where those 9,000 tombstones are buried, and one of those is Houston Duhan. So we essentially accomplished our mission to get him recognized.
Well, what an incredible moment, Jason, and obviously it's indicative, I think, of how rich this history is, and obviously how important it is, and obviously it gives us a little bit of a sense of what you're going to provide for us once your book is finished. So with that, Jason, I'd like to turn it back over to Amanda from Historic New Orleans Collection, who is going to take us through the Q&A session with our online audience.
Awesome. Thank y'all both so much. I have so enjoyed listening to this wonderful conversation. Dr. Theriot, thank you so much for sharing this amazing research that you've been doing. It's been just great. And I want to say to our audience too, I've been really enjoying your the chat, sharing all of your memories of your connections to veterans of World War II. It's been wonderful. So thank y'all. We have some great questions here in the Q&A. I think the first one is, there's been several people, Jason, who are really curious about the honor roll book that you showed at the beginning of the webinar. Some people are curious about if it's possible to get a copy, where they might be able to find a copy of this. If you could just show it again.
Well, so these are out of print, but I would guess that just about every little community in America probably did something like this. I mean, there's a book like this in Brobridge. I know there's one in Lake Charles, even in a smaller community like Jeanerette. So there's probably in your local library some kind of a little book that was produced after the war, if you're lucky to find one. But that's where I discovered this little book first. So it's called The Honor Roll of Iberia Parish Veterans in World War II, printed in 1945 and reprinted in 93.
Awesome. All right, thank you. Well, let's see. I have a couple of questions that are asking about Louisiana Creoles and their experience serving in World War II. Do you have any information about that? Did you interview any people who identify as Creole?
I did. I interviewed a gentleman, Fontenette, on his front porch in the little town of Olivier, and he was actually at the North African campaign and was actually at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, believe it or not. So he was a mechanic, and he was a fairly old gentleman at the time that I interviewed him, some 16, 17 years ago, and he had a little American flag in his front yard. And the interesting story that he told me was that when he came back from the war, there were a number of German prisoners that were held nearby his home. who had been captured at Tunisia at the final battle of North Africa. And he would go, after he got back from the war, he would go and talk with them in French and German to try to communicate, to find out what battle they had been at, how did they get captured, and to just sort of try to make friends with these Germans. So really interesting story there with Mr. Funkman.
Absolutely. We have a question here, and it actually kind of leads back to the topic. The reason we're doing this tonight, which is at HNOC, we're celebrating our exhibition, Cajun Document, Acadiana 1973-74. Now, obviously that is about 30 years after the war, so it's a bit jump in time, but this person is asking about the development of CDAPhil. They say CDAPhil was founded in 1968, many years after the end of World War II. If soldiers came back with a feeling of pride for their French, any thoughts about why CDAPhil did not start until 1968? And maybe Jason, just first of all, tell people who aren't familiar what CDAPhil is.
Great question. You should get a prize. So, CDAPhil, the Council on the Development of French in Louisiana, was a program that was enacted by the state in 1968 for the primary reason to preserve the French language and to teach it to the next generation of people. So you're right, that's 20 years later after the war. Why did it take the state of Louisiana and the French advocates so long to really actively move to be able to develop programs? So that's one thought, right? Another thought is that many of these guys were busy working, raising families, trying to make a living, trying to put the war behind them. And so not a whole lot of time to maybe focus on kind of bigger picture items. But there were, very interesting, there was at the time sort of the development of cultural and heritage festivals, right? One of the first ones was the Dairy Festival in Abbeville, where it was impressed upon people that we are here to celebrate our Cajun, French, Acadian heritage. And there were many festivals that were coming about in the late 50s and in the 1960s. So there already was sort of an underlying movement to celebrate this culture and this language and all the wonderful things that go along with the culture, right? The cuisine, the music, very important. Shortly after the war, all the Cajuns began to start playing Cajun music again, right? And so that music has kind of been the glue that's kind of kept the culture together. But the other really interesting point about CDAPhil is if you look at the authors of the bill, many of them have Acadian surnames. And I know of at least half a dozen of them who were World War II veterans, including Sam Broussard, who was one of the Special Forces OSS agents who was actively involved in the Normandy campaign, and Bert Angel from Burbridge, who was also writing letters, or copies of his letters, writing back home. He was very involved in politics. Roy Theriot from St. Martinville. So I could keep going, but you get the point. There were many of these guys who saw and experienced this big change during World War II, and many of them saw the need to do something about it. And so I do think, in my opinion, that the seeds for this cultural revival movement were planted with the Cajuns in World War II.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question that's coming to us via Facebook Live. This is from Susan, and she's asking if this concept of Frenchies or French-speaking soldiers from Louisiana continued after World War II. So did the Army, did the military keep recruiting French-speaking people from Louisiana to serve in the military?
Great question. I have received so many emails and phone calls over the last couple of years of people who served in the Korean conflict, who served in very similar roles. And many of them were called Frenchie. Probably in the last couple of days, I've received, a couple of messages. My grandfather was nicknamed Frenchie and he was in Korea. And so, yeah, that idea of that nickname kind of continued on. And certainly with the armed forces, realizing that, hey, it's important that we continue to develop the linguistic side of our, of our military. for all the right reasons. So they finally began making sense of the need to have bilingual American soldiers involved in military operations.
Absolutely, that's great. I have a question here from Jennifer. It's such a fun question. She says, my grandfather was in North Africa during World War II. He didn't talk much about his time there, but he did say that he met the Shah of Iran. Have you heard of others with that experience?
Not meeting the Shah of Iran per se, but several of these Cajuns were interpreters for some pretty high brass. Some guys who were way up in the ranks, some colonels and even some generals. And so there's some stories out there about these Cajuns who were driving the colonels around and taking them on these big grand dinners and going to the big meetings and being able to interpret, for them with the French and with the Belgians and they were going to the big grand dinner. So quite a different experience from the guys in the foxholes, but important nonetheless, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely, very different. Um, Somebody, Nathan is asking, he says, great presentation. My friend's grandfather was a translator in Bordeaux in World War I. If you have time, could you also touch upon Cajuns in World War I if you have done any research on them serving in that war?
Yeah, I have not, but there are a collection of about a dozen or so oral histories that were done by Barry Oncelet at the University of Louisiana. And he recorded some interviews with some World War I veterans who used their French. These would have been Cajuns from South Louisiana. And so those interviews were done, gosh, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. So I do know that there is a collection of those at UL.
Great, wonderful. Um, let's see. We have an anonymous attendee who writes, there's a large Francophone population in Maine and other New England states. In your research, did you come across any interaction between soldiers from these two Francophone communities?
Yes, yes. I'll bet that there are historians up there in the New England states and in the Canadian Maritime provinces who you would hope that they've also been tracking down some of the travels and kind of recreating the story of their French-speaking soldiers and the roles that they played. I mean, obviously there was several units of Canadians that landed in Normandy and participated in the Battle of Europe and in elsewhere. So I don't have a story specifically of a French-speaking Cajun run into a French-speaking Canadian, but I'm sure that incident probably occurred more than once.
Absolutely, absolutely. Renee is asking when your book is going to be available to purchase.
Gotta write it first, Renee. It's in the process of I'm in the process of writing it right now, and still there's just so much information and so many letters to read, and there's still a half a dozen or so World War II veterans who are still out there hanging on, and obviously with the pandemic it's been very difficult to get to them, but I have full intentions of trying to track down the last remaining French-speaking Cajuns World War II veterans and to capture their story. So I want the time to do that and to be able to add that in as well. So be looking forward probably sometime in a year and a half from now.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone stay tuned and check Jason Theriot's website. I think it's www.jasontheriot.com. Is that it?
Yes, and I should also promote and advertise our podcast. We have started a podcast. We've got we received a generous donation from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and we have already cut and ran our first podcast show. It's about 30 minutes long, and the title of it is Frenchie, the story of speaking Cajuns of World War II, as told by the veterans themselves. So these are all the old little micro cassette tapes that I walked around and interviewed with that have since been restored and digitized. And we've got some experts down at the Center of Louisiana Studies who are the best in the business at preserving those audio files. And we've already done our first one. It's with Brigadier General Bob LeBlanc from Abbeville, a name who we spoke about tonight, who's still alive and well, and was part of that OSS clan. And so we did a really nice podcast with him. There's a wonderful exchange in French between he and my grandfather, talking about the first moment that Bob arrives in Normandy and how he was able to negotiate some cigarettes for some Calvados, which is a pretty heavy duty brandy liqueur. And so it's on the website. You can go listen to it right now. And we plan on rolling out, the series of podcasts throughout the rest of the year. So look for it.
I look forward to that. And we will, before we leave tonight, I'll post Jason Theriot's website in the chat for everyone. We got a couple more questions here I'd love to get to. There's been several questions. People are asking if any of the people you interviewed talked about having a hard time. Were there any kind of issues with dialect or accents with French people from one part from here, understanding people in North Africa or in Europe, and any kind of trouble with that?
I'll just read you a statement from Thomas Duhan in his own words. This is what he said. My Cajun French has been very handy. This is him writing from France in 1944. In fact, my French is more correct than most of the dialects I have heard in Normandy and Brittany. This is not the first time that I've run across a document like this. There have been many occurrences where the French people were shocked at the particular kind of dialect, the patois that these Cajuns used, because it's the old French that had come from 400 or 500 years before, when the French first left France and went to Acadie in the 1600s and the 1700s. And that ancient dialect of the country folks in France was largely preserved by the Acadians and then the Cajuns. So many of these French people were just blown away that these Cajuns were speaking the language of their grandparents from the Normandy and the Brittany countryside. So yes, certainly having that very gifted ability to not only speak French, but a certain kind of French that was native to the land where you're stationed and you're operating in. So, no wonder that they need recognition, right?
Absolutely. I'm just looking through the questions. A couple of people have brought up, and it's not really a question, but there was a TV show called Combat, and there was a Cajun character on the TV show. Are you familiar with this, Jason?
His name was Cajun. I want to say it probably in the 1960s. It was a black and white, sort of like a little mini series of combat, where there was a group and they would go off into combat, and there was a goofy Cajun guy named Cajun who kind of spoke in a dialect, I guess similar, although he was not from South Louisiana. I'm not sure where he was from. I heard he was from New York or something, but he had been trained pretty well to replicate the French. But certainly what these guys were able to do and having that ability to be able to use that bilingual skill was extremely valuable and important to them. And I do think that it changed their attitudes about their culture and about their identity. And in some sense, I think it was the first time that they began to recognize a real pride in this culture and identifying with this Cajun heritage, this French-speaking heritage. So I think it was transformative.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us this evening. I saw that we posted the link to Jason's website in the chat, everyone, if you want to go and learn more about the project and about the podcast. If you want to learn a little bit more about the exhibition, Cajun Document, we will be interviewing the curator and the photographers this coming Friday. I'm going to post a link to that event here in the chat as well. So you can go ahead and check it out and hopefully see us there. But Dr. Dawsey, Dr. Theriot, thank y'all so much for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Jason. This was really wonderful.
Great questions, Dr. Dawsey. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And have a good night, everyone. Thank y'all so much for joining us.